The morning before my wedding, my grandmother asked me to come sit with her on the back porch while the coffee was still percolating. My younger brother had been sent to the barn on some errand we both understood was invented. It was just the two of us, and the air smelled like pine sap and the particular kind of stillness that settles over the Louisiana hill country before the heat comes up. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment someone finally tells me something real. She took my hands in hers. She had the hands of a woman who had spent 60 years doing what needed doing without complaint, spotted and strong in the way that kind of life makes hands strong. And she looked at me with an expression I still can't fully name, somewhere between genuine love and something else I've since come to think of as a shared wound being passed quietly down a line. Then she said, "A good wife keeps a soft heart and a trusting spirit. That will carry you through everything." And then she squeezed my hands once, stood up, and went back inside to check on the biscuits. That was it. That was the whole conversation. One sentence of preparation before the most disorienting night of my life. I was 19 years old. If you're new here, my name is Nora, and this is where I talk about growing up inside a tight knit conservative faith community in rural North Louisiana and the things that almost nobody in that world was ever permitted to say plainly. If any part of what I just described sounds familiar to you in your bones, I'm glad you found your way here, and I hope you'll stay a while. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribing genuinely helps because every time someone does, it tells me there are real people out there on the other side of this who needed to hear something true said out loud. I want to be careful about something before I go further because I think it matters more than almost anything else I'll say today. What I'm about to describe wasn't a rare thing where I grew up. It wasn't whispered about in the way rare and shameful things get whispered about. It was the ordinary and expected shape of nearly every young woman's experience in our community. Some of us were told a little more than I was. Some were told considerably less. But the silence itself, the particular architecture of it, was the same for almost all of us. And that silence didn't stay politely contained to a single night. It followed us into kitchens and bedrooms and long, bewildered years of marriage, into a specific kind of loneliness that none of us had the language to describe even to each other, because the very words we might have used had been quietly removed from our reach before we ever needed them. This is that story. Where I grew up, a girl learned what she needed to know about marriage through three unspoken lessons. Not three conversations, not three pamphlets or careful explanations from women who loved her. Three lessons that lived in the air of every church service and family gathering and sideways remark, absorbed the way you absorb weather without ever being asked to consent to it. I've turned these lessons over so many times in the years since I left, the way you might turn over something you found buried in the yard, unable to stop yourself once you've started. And every time I do, I arrive at the same conclusion. There were three lessons. They were treated as complete. And not a single one of them was true in any way that helped us navigate the actual lives we were walking into. The first lesson was that a husband's ease came before a wife's understanding. Nobody said this plainly because nothing about the body was ever said plainly in our world. But it was threaded through every sermon about a wife's proper place, every quiet exchange between older women in the church fellowship hall that carried a kind of weary, practiced resignation I spent years mistaking for contentment. It was there every time the preacher moved through the marriage passages with that particular solemnity that settled over the congregation like a hand pressing down. He leads, you follow. Whatever he needs, you provide. And your own interior life in that regard isn't really part of the arrangement you're entering. About 10 days before my wedding, my Aunt Clara found a moment to take me aside after a church potluck. Aunt Clara was one of those women the whole community orbited around without quite knowing why. She had a steadiness to her that made you feel certain everything would work out, had raised 5 children in a house that was never particularly large, and somehow always seemed to have room for whoever needed it. I thought, if anyone was going to hand me something real, it would be her. She took hold of my hands and looked at me with a warmth I've never doubted was genuine, and she said, "Men aren't complicated, Nora. They just need to feel respected and wanted. Give him that and everything else follows." I nodded as though I understood. I didn't. I had no idea what feeling respected and wanted had to do with the specific thing that frightened me, the thing I didn't even have clear words for, the approaching event I had spent months trying very hard not to think about in any concrete way. But I smiled and thanked her, and that was the closest thing to real preparation anyone who loved me ever offered. The second lesson was harder to name even now, years later. It was the belief, held and transmitted with absolute sincerity, that the less a woman thought about her own body, the more she demonstrated her virtue. Modesty in our world wasn't only about the length of a skirt or whether you wore your hair pinned. It was a discipline of the mind. You didn't examine your own wants. You didn't ask questions about your own physical self, even in the silence of your own head, because asking made the thing real. And realness in that territory was treated as its own kind of danger. I grew up genuinely believing that a girl with proper values simply didn't think about her wedding night, that the act of thinking about it was already a small betrayal of who she was supposed to be. So I tried not to. And when the fear came in anyway, as it always did in the dark, when the questions with nowhere to go pressed up against the inside of my chest, I pushed them back down and told myself that God would make it clear when the time came. That was the phrase handed to us over and over in the same gentle circular way that kept us from noticing it wasn't actually an answer. Trust your husband. God will guide you. Your body will understand. Your body will understand. I have sat with that sentence so many times since I left. Because in one very limited sense, yes, a body understands things. It understands hunger and cold and the warmth of a hand held in the dark. But a body that has spent 19 years being carefully taught not to listen to its own signals, taught that physical self awareness is something adjacent to sin, is not a trustworthy guide to anything at all. That body has been patiently and thoroughly trained to work against itself. Nobody warned us about that. Nobody sat us down and said, "You may walk into your wedding night afraid of your own skin." And that fear will have been deliberately cultivated in you over the course of your entire life. Nobody thought it important for us to know. If something in what I'm describing is landing somewhere in you, if you grew up in any community or family that handed you silence and called it preparation, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like on this video. It sounds like a small thing, but it helps more people find these stories, and there are more people out there who need to hear someone say this plainly than you might think. The third lesson was the quietest, and I've come to believe it was the cruelest because it was the one with the longest reach. We were taught that a husband's patience was a precious and delicate resource, and a good wife never put unnecessary demands on it. In practice, in the actual rooms of our actual marriages, this meant that if something hurt, if something confused you, if something felt wrong in a way you couldn't even name, the correct response was stillness. A good wife didn't complain. A good wife didn't make her husband feel he had failed her or disappointed her. A good wife moved through whatever the night brought and rose the next morning and made coffee and carried on as though nothing had needed enduring at all. My closest friend growing up, a girl named Susanna, married at 20. Susanna was the kind of person who made every room she walked into feel a degree or two warmer. The sort of woman who kept a running mental list of every person she loved and what they were going through, who showed up without being asked and stayed as long as she was needed. Years after we'd both left the community, she told me what her own wedding night had actually been like. She said the hardest part wasn't the pain, though there was pain, and it wasn't the confusion, though there was plenty of that too. The hardest part was that her husband, who she said she truly believed was a decent man who never wanted to hurt her, fell asleep almost immediately afterward, and she lay there in an unfamiliar room in the dark with no framework whatsoever for what had just happened to her body and her life. She didn't know if it was supposed to feel that way. She didn't know if the strangeness she felt, the specific quality of it, was a sign that something had gone wrong or whether this was simply what marriage was. She told me she stared at the ceiling until the light started to come gray through the curtains, and then she got up and made breakfast and said nothing to anyone. Because the third lesson had taken root exactly the way it was designed to, a good wife's silence was the most visible proof of her faithfulness. Susanna carried that silence for almost 9 months before an older woman from her congregation, never directly because nothing real was ever said directly in our world, made a sideways remark about something she kept in her nightstand. A knowing look held one beat longer than it needed to be, A door cracked open just wide enough for Susanna to understand that a door existed. 9 months, because no one had told her it was there. My own wedding was held at my grandparents' property on a Saturday in late April. Close to 150 people came, filling the house and spilling out under the pecan trees and across the long, flat yard, under a sky that was pale blue and perfectly clear in the way spring skies get, in that part of Louisiana before the humidity settles in for the summer. We had been cooking for 3 days: pulled pork and potato salad, and 3 kinds of pie and a sheet cake that took up most of the counter. The whole place smelled like sweet tea and wood smoke, and something else underneath all of it: the smell of people who had known each other their whole lives crowded together in a space built for exactly this kind of gathering. The ceremony itself was long, the way they always were. The pastor spoke about the sacred responsibilities of marriage, about what a husband owed his household, and what a wife owed her husband, and what both of them owed to God. I sat in my white dress with my hands folded in my lap and listened. And underneath the listening, I kept circling back to the porch from that morning. That one sentence: a good wife keeps a soft heart and a trusting spirit. That will carry you through everything. By the time Daniel and I were finally alone that night, I had been awake for nearly 18 hours. My feet ached in a way that had moved up past my knees. My face felt stiff from holding a smile at people all day. The room we'd been given was simple: a bed frame that had belonged to his parents, a quilt in blues and creams that his mother had made the previous winter, a lamp on the dresser casting a warm, unsteady light across the walls, a window that let in the sound of crickets and the distant sound of someone's hound settling in for the night. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and loosened his collar, and when he looked across at me, I understood in that specific moment that we were both, equally and completely, terrified. He had been given almost nothing either. His father's entire conversation with him, he told me much later, on a night when we'd finally gotten far enough down the road to be honest with each other, had been about provision and leadership and what it meant to take on the responsibility of a family. Nothing about the room we were sitting in now. Nothing about the girl across from him, whose hands he could certainly see were not entirely steady. We were two people who had been handed a life together and pressed gently but firmly into a room with no real instructions, no map, and an unspoken expectation on the part of everyone who loved us that we would somehow arrive at the other side of the night intact. What happened wasn't cruel. Daniel was careful in the particular way that someone is careful when they genuinely do not want to cause harm, but have no real idea what harm might look like in this context, or what to do if it appears. There was confusion I hadn't been prepared for. There were moments I wanted to say something, anything, and genuinely did not know if saying it was permitted. Because that was the whole lesson, wasn't it? A good wife trusts. A good wife doesn't put unnecessary strain on a husband's patience. Your body will understand. My body didn't understand anything. My body was asking questions that no one had ever seen fit to answer. Afterward, Daniel pulled me close in the dark and asked quietly if I was all right. I said yes. It wasn't quite a lie. I was all right in the sense that I was present, still breathing, still recognizably myself in whatever shape that now meant. But I was also all right in the very particular way that you say you're all right when you have no vocabulary for what you actually are, when the only words anyone ever gave you were endurance and trust and submission. And none of those words quite means all right, but none of them means the opposite exactly either. We lay there for a long time. The lamp burned low, the ordinary sounds of the April night drifting in through the screen, indifferent to the fact that something had shifted permanently for me in that room. I didn't sleep for a long time. I lay there trying to decide whether what I was feeling was something I was allowed to feel, and arrived at no useful answer because no one had ever given me the tools for that particular task. 2.5 years after I left the community, which was itself a slow and quiet kind of leaving, a matter of stopped calls and letters that went unanswered, and a physical distance that gradually became the kind of distance that doesn't close on its own, I started seeing a therapist. A woman with a small office near a park, plants on every surface, a quality of attention that didn't flinch and didn't rush. In one of our early sessions, I described my wedding night to her, not dramatically, just plainly. The way you describe something you've been carrying in silence for so long, that simply putting it into sentences feels like an act of recklessness. Testing each word to see if it can actually hold what you mean by it. Going slowly because you're not sure how it sounds from the outside. She listened without the particular expression people sometimes get that somehow makes you feel worse than the thing you're describing. When I finished, she said something I have never fully stopped thinking about. She said, "You weren't left without preparation because nobody loved you. You were left without preparation because the system you were inside needed you unprepared." I sat with that for a long time afterward, in the way you sit with something that is both entirely new and somehow already familiar. The way a sentence can feel like an explanation of something you've always half known but never had the right shape for, because she was right. A young woman who understands her own body, who has language for her own experience, who has been taught that her own comfort is a legitimate concern and not a selfishness to be suppressed, is a much more difficult person to keep in a certain kind of silence. That woman asks questions. That woman might say, "Wait," or "I'm not ready," or "This doesn't feel right to me and I need you to stop." And a woman who says those things out loud, who has been given words for those things and permission to use them, is someone a closed system cannot hold quite as easily. The silence I grew up inside wasn't really about modesty, though it used modesty as its justification. It was structural. It was load bearing. It held certain things in place, and it had been transmitted so carefully, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, generation after generation, down a long chain of women who each believed they were simply passing on what was true and good, that no one in that chain had ever stopped to turn it over and ask whether it was kind, whether it was honest, whether it bore any resemblance to what love is actually supposed to feel like when it works the way it's meant to. If you've stayed with me through all of this, I want you to know I'm genuinely grateful, and I don't use that word lightly. Stories like this one aren't easy to put into language, and they're not easy to sit inside of either. If you want to hear more, subscribing really does matter to me in a practical way because every person who finds this channel is one more person who gets to hear something honest instead of the silence. I want to say one more thing before I close, and it's the most important thing. I'm not telling this story to make anyone hate where I came from. I left with things I carry gladly to this day, and I want to be clear about that. A genuine work ethic that has gotten me through years that had no business being as hard as they were. A sense of belonging so bone deep, I'm not sure I'll ever fully replace it. And I'm not entirely sure I want to. A faith that has been broken and rebuilt in a different shape. A quieter shape. A shape I sometimes don't recognize, but one that is still mine in a way I don't know how to let go of. I don't want to pretend any of those things away, and I won't. But I tell this story because what happened to me and to Susanna and to nearly every girl I grew up alongside didn't only happen in one community in one corner of Louisiana. It is not a regional thing or a denominational thing or a thing contained to a particular decade. There are girls right now in other towns, other churches, other families, organized around other versions of the same silence, being handed the same absence of information and being told it is virtue. Girls sitting at kitchen tables being given one sentence or none at all, and being sent forward into marriages and rooms and entire lives for which they have no real language. Girls who will lie awake tonight in an unfamiliar bed, trying to make sense of what just happened with no framework for the asking, let alone the answering. I want every one of them to hear what nobody told me on that April night. Your body is not a mystery you are supposed to be frightened of. It belongs to you. You are allowed to understand it. You are allowed to have questions about it. And you are allowed to say, "This doesn't feel right," or "I'm not ready yet," or "I need us to slow down," and have those words mean exactly what they say. They are not immodesty. They are not a failure of faith or love or wifely duty. They are not selfishness or weakness or a sign that something is wrong with you. They are simply the most basic thing any person is owed, at any age, in any room. I was 19 years old, sitting across from my husband in a lamp-lit room with no words for what I needed and no permission to ask for them, even if I'd had them. I'm not 19 anymore, and I'll keep doing whatever I can to make sure the words exist somewhere, out loud, in a place where anyone who needs them has a chance of finding them, because the silence was never holy. It was only ever silence. And silence handed down from love is still just silence. it still leaves a girl alone in the dark. If something in this story found you, I'd really like to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what landed. Tell me what stayed with you after. And if you have your own story and you're ready to tell it, even a piece of it, I'm listening, and so is everyone reading alongside you. You are far less alone in this than the silence was ever willing to let you believe. Until next time, your voice was always yours, even on the nights you were taught to keep it swallowed.